Conflict between communism and democracy has raged in North and South Korea for years. On June 24, 1950, dictator of North Korea Kim Il-sung sent his troops across the 38th parallel with intentions to unite the peninsula under one communistic government. South Korea, being a republic alongside the U.S., wanted to preserve its freedom. Due to the compromise reached in the Korean Armistice Agreement of 1953, each side of Korea came to an agreement to draw a demilitarized zone at the 38th parallel and halt all shooting.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. Free nations must be on their guard, more than ever before.
Korea is a peninsula in East Asia. Russia and China border it to the north and west. Japan lies across the sea to the east. From 1910 to 1945, Japan ruled Korea as a colony. At the end of World War II and Japan's defeat, the heads of three great nations, Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, had guaranteed that Korea was to be a free and independent nation with the government of its own choosing. A decision was made between the nations to divide Korea temporarily along the 38th parallel, a latitudinal line that bisected the country. The North was backed by the Soviet Union, and America supported the South. When it was agreed that some form of government would need to be established in Korea, elections were called for throughout the peninsula. However, the Soviets refused to hold elections in the North. In May 1948, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin proclaimed a communist state in North Korea. Stalin appointed Kim Il-sung as North Korea's leader. In August, a Democratic Republic of Korea was established in South Korea. Syngman Rhee was elected president of South Korea.
The U.S. and the Soviet Union plunged into a new kind of war. They did not clash directly in battle. Instead, they competed for power around the world and especially in Korea. This rivalry became known as the Cold War. President Truman feared that if Korea fell under communist forces, the Soviet Union would spread even farther. He was determined to keep Soviet influence contained within existing boundaries. This Cold War policy was known as the containment. Conflict between communism and democracy government gradually increased. The two sides both believed that the peninsula should be united under their form of government. Unable to reach an early compromise, the conflict quickly escalated.
In 1949, Kim Il-sung visited Stalin in Moscow, Russia. He persuaded Stalin that he could conquer South Korea. He wanted to see communism expand. However, he feared involvement in a direct war with America that could involve nuclear weapons. He did not think that America would get involved, so he gave his approval. Kim Il-sung also went to see Chairman Mao Zedong, the leader of China, to get his support. Initiating the battle phase of the war, the North Korean army marched across the 38th parallel towards the capital of South Korea, Seoul, on June 25, 1950. President Truman responded immediately. He called for a resolution to the invasion, and the United Nations Security Council met in an emergency session and approved a U.S. resolution calling for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of North Korean forces to the 38th parallel. America was able to win resolution due to the Soviet Union's recent absence from the Security Council.
In a matter of days, U.S. land, air, and sea forces had joined the battle in aid of South Korea. General Douglas MacArthur was named commander of UN Combined Forces by President Truman. Officially, America's presence in Korea amounted to no more than a police action. Military engagements were authorized by United Nations Security Council resolutions and funded by Congress. America never officially declared war on North Korea. War had soon become a battle of attrition for both sides. Hope of unifying Korea under one form of government was lost. The U.S. and the USSR were forced to consider that resolution could not be imposed by either side through complete military victory, at least at acceptable cost. After almost 1 year of fighting, Truman's top officials pressured for armistice, and finally, Truman decided to follow their suggestion by negotiating with China. General MacArthur received this news with shock. MacArthur was determined to win the war and destroy communism in Korea. Outraged with recent news, he made a public, unauthorized statement threatening the Chinese with imminent destruction if they did not withdraw from Korea. Truman fired the general for insubordination.
Initial armistice talks started at Panmunjom, a village bordering North and South Korea. Negotiations were halted over this discord and were heightened when the United Nations suggested that prisoners of war could decide whether or not they wished to be returned to their home country. According to the Geneva Conventions of 1949, if a prisoner did not want to be returned, they would be set at liberty. This infuriated North Korean delegation, and in May of 1952, North Korea made a strategic move to compel the United Nations to withdraw their demands. North Korea captured a U.S. officer and offered to trade him for the release of United Nations command admissions of inhumane treatment of captives. However, United Nations command refused to give in. The conflict of interest remained the issue of the return of the prisoners and the treatment of them in the United Nations camp. The U.S.'s goal was to ultimately end the war quickly, while North Korea's intention was to regain all prisoners of war. While the bloodshed continued, talks at Panmunjom continued with little progress. As the Korean conflict entered its third year, Americans were afraid the war would drag on continuously. Our people wanted a leader who could end it quickly. In the U.S. presidential election of 1952, Republican candidate Dwight D. Eisenhower managed to put America's fears to rest.
I shall go to Korea. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace.
After his victory, the president-elect made good on his promise to go to Korea. His trip convinced him that something new was needed to break the diplomatic stalemate at peace talks that had begun in July 1951. Eisenhower stated that if the negotiations were not progressing, he would use military force without inhibition and would no longer be responsible for maintaining peace within the Korean peninsula. Eisenhower's nuclear warnings were taken seriously in the Korean battlefield. Only 3 months after the presidential inauguration, the Chinese compromised. They sent a letter declaring the desire to end the war. The nature of the strategic interaction between the U.S. and the North Koreans was hostile, and their belligerents of both sides used threats and force in order to get the response that they wanted. Next move to end the war on part of the U.S. was to make a proposal that may appeal to their opposition. In May 1953, General Clark proposed to exchange sick and wounded prisoners. This proposal was to benefit both sides and to show an act of kindness and generosity. Making this small compromise was more likely to promote the Korean government to make larger armistice settlements.
2 months later, final details of the armistice were discussed, and compromises were made on the demands for the return of the prisoners of war and the location of the demilitarized zone. On July 27, 1953, the UN, North Korea, and China signed an armistice. South Korea agreed to abide by the terms. It was the end of the longest negotiated armistice in history, 158 meetings spread over 2 years and 17 days. That evening at 10 p.m., the truce went into effect. Under the terms of agreement, both sides agreed to suspend open hostilities, release and return prisoners of war and displaced persons, and withdraw all military forces and equipment from a 4,000-meter wide zone, establishing the demilitarized zone as a buffer between the forces. While the armistice was not a permanent peace treaty, it did prevent both sides from entering the air, ground, or sea areas under control of the other. The armistice also established the Military Armistice Commission and other agencies to discuss any violations and ensure adherence to the truce terms. This agreement was meant to be a temporary agreement until a formal peace treaty could be made, but all peace treaty conventions failed. The armistice remains today as a cessation of all hostilities.
Toll of the war included about 1.2 million deaths in South Korea, 1 million deaths in North Korea, 36,500 deaths for U.S. troops, and 600,000 deaths for Chinese soldiers. South Korea and America are still allies. The main purpose of the alliance is to protect free nations and fight against forces such as communism, terrorism, and other major world issues. Meanwhile, North Korean and American relations have been hostile primarily since the Korean War. These relations have been largely defined by both countries' multiple nuclear weapon tests and ongoing threats. In terms of Korea's division, little changed. However, if America and the United Nations didn't prevent communism from taking over Korea, it is likely that communism would have grown and expanded throughout the globe. To this day, the major conflict between communism and democracy remains, threatening all free and secure nations and the lives of people throughout the world.